Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Resistance United Great Britain. We have Mr. William Gairdner, and we are very appreciative and thankful for your time and your knowledge and for your willingness to share all of that with us. And today we are going to discuss the third chapter of your amazing book called The War Against the Family. I put a link to your webpage in our main group. And the main topic of discussion is the traditional family system. So, William, please, the stage is yours. Kindly guide us and educate us.
Well, I'll try. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me again. I do enjoy being with you all. Uh, so I thought today we should talk about chapter 3 of this book, um, which is not a chapter that I expected to have to write when I was writing it. It's a defense of the traditional family system. And the way I grew up, you never would have thought the family needed any defense. But the world we're living in today makes it obvious that we do. So this was my try to do a kind of wraparound defense of the traditional family. And I have to tell your visitors that once I decided to write this chapter, I knew that I would be parting company with a lot of conservative people, which sounds strange because you would think most conservative people and thinkers defend the natural family. But I found out that that's not the case, that there are many of them which are on side with all sorts of policies, which even then I happen to consider inimical to the health and development of the natural family. And whenever I did my research trying to look into how in the world was I going to write this chapter, I couldn't find very many defenses of the natural family, although I did find uh, a handful of significant ones. And I mention them in the chapter and give references to their works. But I kind of had to come up with a definition of the natural family. I won't say by myself because the definition was probably in the mind somehow, or maybe I'd seen it somewhere. I'm not sure. But at the time, I thought I'm going to have to create a definition that is watertight, because every time I turned around, somebody would tell me, "Well, that's not what the family is. Here's what the family is," or "The family's any number of permutations and combinations." In fact, I have to tell you a little story before we start the chapter. At the time, the United Nations was embarked on something called the Year of the Family. This is actually funny if it weren't so sad. It was called the Year of the Family. And because I had published this book, I got invited to one of their sessions with a bunch of other people. There were about 20 of us sitting around the table. And this woman from the United Nations came to steer the session. And her definition of the family was so loose that I challenged her right in front of everybody. So she said basically that a family is any group of people who care for each other. That's just about as broad as I think it was at Hillary Clinton's saying that it takes a village to raise a family. Well, nobody questioned the benefits of children having lots of friends and relatives who help them make their way through life. But that's not what Clinton was getting at. She was basically dismissing the centrality of the natural family, in my mind, in making that statement. It takes a village to raise a family. The subtext is you can't do it by yourself, folks. It's a socialistic undertaking. That was Plato in drag, if you ask me. At any rate, I'm sitting around this table at the United Nations meeting, and she comes out with her definition of a family as any group of people who care for each other. Oh, and on top of that, I should say before I get to it, up on the wall Up on the wall was a slogan, believe it or not, that the United Nations had been publishing all over the world that year, wherever they went to promote this idea. And the slogan was that the family is the smallest democracy at the heart of society. I'll say it again. The family is the smallest democracy at the heart of society. So I started off by asking her about her slogan. And I said, excuse me, I said, are you saying that if there's a mother and father and 5 kids, there should be a vote on whether the kids should be taught table manners? Or should there be a vote on whether they should do their homework or go to school? Is that what you're saying? That the family is a democracy? I said, I don't think so. I think it's probably the most naturally autocratic structure you could imagine. And it's a good thing, because otherwise there would be no leadership in the family, and children would grow up as very messed up individuals. Well, that just drew a great silence in the room, even from some of the conservatives sitting there who considered themselves so broad-minded. I told them I thought their brains were falling out. And I said, Madam, I said to the UN woman, I said, according to your definition, all of us sitting around this table would be a family. Would you consider us to be a family? Believe it or not, she went like this. Well, you are all working on the same project, and you do all care for each other. So yes, of course, this would be a family. I mean, that's how loose this whole thing was. And that just persuaded me even more strongly that this book was an incredibly important book to write. And I'll apologize for the fact that it's so big. But the reason is I didn't want to have to do 2 books. I wanted to get it over with in one fell swoop. And as I say, at the time, I knew I was parting company with a lot of conservative thinkers who are not really conservative. They're fiscal libertarians who believe in small budgets and smaller government, which I do too. But that's where they stop. They don't really extend their conservatism into meditations on the importance of the natural family. So my definition of the natural family was a one-liner, and it went like this. The natural family is a married mother and father living together with their dependent children, period. And so I can only say I had a lot of fun and a lot of grief too, because I got invited on so many talk shows by hostile moderators, you would hardly believe it. And they were all attacking me on these definitions, you know. One in particular was run by a television consortium in the province of Ontario, where I live. It's called TVO, or TV Ontario. And a nice young man sort of runs this lecture series there. And he invited me in for a discussion of my book. Well, I thought it actually would be just a discussion with him and me and this book. But in fact, when he opened the door, instead of just a table with 2 chairs for him and for me, there were about 15 people in the room and 1 chair up at the front for me. So I was going to be burned at the stake. And these 15 people, except for 3 of them who were just plants. I mean, there was a 75-year-old woman there, and she was the token conservative. There was a minister of some wacko Christian branch of the church. And
you're okay. You're not gonna get COVID.
I'm sorry, I lost you. Whoops.
We are here.
Yeah, but I just lost my picture. I don't know what happened to it. Sorry.
Maybe you have to move between the windows that are open.
I'm so sorry. I must have hit a button here by mistake.
If you do Alt Tab, then you can move between your opened windows, and then you can probably see us again.
So I got Alt
and Tab together.
I'm sorry, I'm not a computer genius. And
did you get it back or not
no,
yet?
No.
1 second. Pickley, can you help me?
Yeah, so if you're looking for the tab button.
Okay, I got it. I got it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to move my hands around so much from now on. At any rate, I walked into the room. There were 15 chairs arranged against me, and the moderator was walking around with his microphone. All these people who he had invited to attack me, except for the elderly woman and this minister of some wacko branch of some church or other. And there was a woman who was a single mother now because with one child, because her husband had left her. At any rate, this went on. Oh, of course, there was a couple of homosexuals too. So he would run around from one person to the other with his microphone and say, well, you heard Mr. Gairdner's definition of the family. You know, and he'd run to two guys and he'd say, these two men are gay and they're both married to each other. Do they have a family? And I said, no, they don't, because they don't have any children. And they can't have any children with each other. They can adopt them, I guess, and have a family that way. But this, if you want to call it a marriage, which I don't, you can call it a marriage too. But it's definitely not a family according to my definition. And then he ran around to the woman whose husband had left her. They were divorced, and she had one child. And he runs up to her, expecting her to be very angry with me. He said, "What do you think about what he just said? What's your situation?" Which he already knew. And she said, "Well," she said, "I'm a single mom now. My husband left the marriage." And well, he said, "What kind of family does she have?" And he was thinking I was going to insult her terribly, which of course I didn't want to do. But I said, "Well, frankly, she has a broken family." And the whole room went silent. And she looked up with tears coming down her cheeks, and she said, "He's absolutely right. I do have a broken family, and I wish so much that it would be whole again." But anyway, I'm only sharing this with you to say that it's really a mixed bag out there. And if you're speaking to groups about books like this, you can bank on getting in trouble. And as I say, saying goodbye to a lot of your conservative friends who actually are much more liberal in the modern sense than they let on. At any rate, this definition of the family is eternal. It's incredibly important to keep it in mind. It's been around, as I say, forever. And one of the distinguishing features of it is what Margaret Mead called a commitment of permanence. Of course, commitment of permanence and still only have a marriage, and maybe a wonderful marriage. But until you have children, you don't have a family. And the commitment of permanence, of course, in her view and mine, was intended to generate the family structure, the married mother and father living together with their dependent children. Now, other types of families exist in the minds of many anthropologists and sociologists and so on. And these I think of as the social family, you know, the village, the in-laws, the relatives, and all those people that do form part of certain family structures in other parts of the world than the West. I mean, even permanent parts of the family. But the natural family, I would defend as I have defined it. Now, there are wonderful books your listeners may want to look at. One of the books which defines the family in the early part of Western history is by a man named Jerome Carcopino. It's called A Day in the Life of Ancient Rome. And in that book, he describes family life in ancient Rome. I tell you, it looks exactly the same as family life wherever you come from, or wherever I come from, or grew up. Really no difference. And it's a very touching book. At one point in the book, he talks about what I would call the Roman baby exchange. just like today, and despite all the talk about contraception and birth control, which we'll get to later in the other coming chapters of this book, the Romans had lots of unwanted childbirth and unwanted children. But they had a kind of special part of the city of Rome, which was like a piazza or a square. And he describes in the most beautiful kind of furtive language how after dark, the women who didn't want their babies would take them to the square all swaddled in their clothes and blankets, whatever, and leave them at the place that everyone knew was where you go to get a baby. And the women who couldn't conceive, who were trying to have children but couldn't, they would go there and get themselves a baby and pick it up and take it away on the other side of the square to their home to start their family with this adopted child. It was a lovely scene, really, and in many ways a lot more humane than what we're doing today with abortuaries, if you want to call them that. We'll also get to my chapter on abortion, and you better be sitting down when we do, because there's going to be some tears in that chapter. And I think I mentioned in one of my early sessions with this group that the abortion question is probably the most important, the key question and conception of the modern democracies, because it's been a technological methodology we have developed to get rid of the fruits of the unwanted fruits of our sexual passions. And we have covered the whole thing up with legal camouflage to declare the human being a non-human until it is parted completely from the body of its mother. And this particular little adventure, which is, I think, terribly sad, has, in my mind, has defined all the modern democracies, as with the exception of, I think, Poland and maybe, I don't know where else, one of the South American countries where abortion is banned, as slave regimes of a new kind. Well, I mentioned that before, and I'm mentioning it now, and frankly, it can't be mentioned enough because it does not sink in to the modern mind. Just like chattel slavery did not sink in to the average mind. Slave owners, chattel slave owners in past centuries considered it normal. Aristotle considered it normal. Lots of people considered it normal. Everybody was doing it. So nobody saw it as an abnormal thing to do. And just as today, everybody thinks abortion is not abnormal, that it's a normal thing to do if you're in a jam like that. And I think it's going to take some kind of new Wilberforce to shake modernity out of its misconception in this regard, if ever. At any rate, Carcapino wrote a lovely book about Rome, so I'm suggesting people get it and read it. It's only about 100 pages, but it's a lovely book. And then where did I go for more up-to-date stuff in the intervening centuries? I went to a man named Alan Macfarlane, a British sociologist who wrote another lovely book called The Origins of English Individualism. And in that book, you'll find lots of arguments and data which reverse our common misunderstandings about the development of the Western world and the role of the family and of marriage and of property in it. And, by the way, in the lives of women, where, you know, we tend to get this mythology, this idea that women didn't have any rights at all back in the day. In fact, there were certain rights they certainly didn't have, which they now do. But there were lots of rights they had then, which we don't think they had, which they indeed did. So Macfarlane's book will open your eyes on that score. And then a third book I recommend, and then I'll stop recommending books, is by a woman named Linda Pollock. And she wrote a book called Forgotten Children. And how she wrote her book was she went to 400 or 500 diaries that she located, which people had written in past centuries about their families and about their children. And contrary to the standard story, which people got when they started researching the family, that, children were incidental, no one really cared much about them. And when they died, there wasn't really much grief or sadness. It was just kind of part of the deal and all that kind of thing. She shows that, at least on the basis of these diaries, but that was the farthest thing from the truth. There's always been parental love. There's always been the strong desire of both parents to look after their children in the best way that they could, and so on. And that's why she calls her book Forgotten Children, because actually it's we who forgot them, not the people of the day that she talks about in her book. So anyway, so much for the historical evidence. Oh, maybe there's one more I should mention. There was a book written about France in the age of the Gnostic revolutions against the Christian religion. There was a part of France called Albi. The town is called Albi, and the people who lived there were called Albigensians, and they had particular theories about Christ, and which were very different from those being taught by the Catholic Church at the time. And so a French writer named Roy Ladurie wrote a book called Montaillou. Now, Montaillou was another village near Albi, which was populated by these Gnostic thinkers. It was kind of like a sect. We can talk about Gnosticism later, because I do have something on that in my chapter, and I spent a certain amount of my time in my scholarly life studying it and writing about it. At any rate, I mentioned a book called Montaillou, Montaillou, by Roy Ladurie, Ladurie. It's an interesting book, maybe a little dry, but for historians among you, you'll find it interesting, because there you can see the patterns of family life, patterns of childcare, patterns of family love and concern, which once again run up against the standard conception, or misconception that we tend to have about how parents dealt with their families in the historical past. So that's an important aspect of this book. I mean, clearing the air. Let's move on then to some of the traditional values themselves, such as I have pulled them together. The first thing I wanted to say was that sociology, when I wrote this book, tended to discuss the family as a mediating institution. And what they meant by that was that you have the state at the top, and you have the individual at the bottom, which is true, and you have the family in the middle, which somehow mediates relations between these freestanding individuals and the state and everything that it does at the top. And right away, that got my dander up, because my reaction to that phrase, mediating institution, was nuts. It's not a mediating institution. It's an originating institution. The family is the origin of wholesome individuals and the origin of wholesome families in itself and in the way it conducts its life and its self-governance. Out of that comes the state, and out of that comes wholesome, thriving individuals. And all of these depend upon the work of the natural family in society. So as I often have to say to my kids when they're talking about political arguments that they have with people, I say, you got to get used to telling people you reject the terms they're using. And they're going to look at you like frightened, concerned. They're going to say, what do you mean? You reject it. And then you got a chance to tell them why the term is not appropriate, and fill them in with what you've learned. Well, I rejected the term mediating institution because I was created by a bunch of administrative sociologists, and it's completely wrong. as I say, you have to start thinking of the family as originating institution. It's the heart of human life. And because we are social beings, it's the heart of human social life. It's, in fact, what someone named Ralph Linton called, and I'll just quote his paragraph, he referred to the ancient trinity of father, mother. I like the phrase, the ancient trinity of father, mother, and child. It has survived more vicissitudes than any other human relationship. It is the bedrock underlying all other social structures. In the Götterdämmerung, which overwise science and overfoolish statesmanship are preparing for us, the last man will spend his last hours searching for his wife and child. That was written in a book he wrote called The Natural History of the Family in 1951. Okay, so I guess I'm going to say then that whether we're talking about Rome or the modern state, the trend, regrettably, has been, and Rome, by the way, was the first big example of this. Oh gosh, here I go. I'm going to mention another book to you, if I can remember the name of it, made by Robert Nisbet, called The Quest for Community. I really recommend everybody get that book. The Quest for Community, he wrote, and he based his discussion initially in ancient Rome and then brought it all the way forward to modern times, showing how running all through the quest for community has been this struggle against the efforts of the state to invade the family and break down the family structure and to create what I call, for today, a hyper-democratic society. That's a society which is comprised primarily of individuals who are considered the key elements of all the structures around us, from whom supposedly the family is created and the state takes its being. But what I'm trying to point out here is that in Nisbet's book and my own, and I took quite a bit of his thinking from him, is that the state has made an effort to break down the family and to offer what I call substitute love for the love of the family. We'll see all through the rest of this book how that takes place. Okay, so attacking the family and fracturing these institutions that stand between and which protect the individual from the state ends up being something I describe as coercive humanitarianism. It presents itself as humanitarian. Isn't it true that everybody listening to this talk would say that all through the time they've grown up, the state and what it does has been presented to them as beneficial, as good for them, as healthy, as a contribution to their way of life? I mean, that's how I grew up. I don't think anybody ever told me, watch out, that the state can do great evil and can actually contribute significantly to the erosion and the breakdown of its own living civil society by fragmenting that society, weakening the status of the private family within the state, such that the relationship is not so much between the parents and their children as between the state and its citizens. And one of the ways that the state breaks down the family is substitute love, as I call it, to offer services to the private family, which tend to make the private family less important, less crucial, less of what I call an originating institution. Let me give you an example right around where I live. I live in a small town called King City here in Ontario. And 30 years ago, when I first moved here, if you wanted to take part in a certain sport or a dance club or flower arranging or who knows what, you would probably be trying to contact some citizen group who did those things. Where's the soccer club? Where do I find the local soccer club? My kids are interested in soccer or, hockey, or one of my kids wants to study dance. Where do I find a dance studio or organization, whatever? Citizens tended to get together and organize these things themselves. Now, 30 years later, my town has a little book. Well, it's not that little. It's about 60 or 80 pages. It's actually a large format book of services provided to citizens by the town. It now has a recreation department. And 30 years ago, you could phone them and say, do we have any grassy fields where we can take our kids to play soccer in this town? Oh, yeah, you go to so-and-so and so-and-so. Now you get to join the soccer club through the town. The town is running the soccer clubs, running all these activities which show up in this booklet for citizens. You have to call the town to get involved, not your neighbors, which is how it used to be. And the recreation department of my town now has 6 full-time employees. These people are, God bless them, they're doing a good job. But it's not a job that I think has to be done, ought to be done by them. They're probably paid $80,000 a year each. I don't know. Good salary, good living, whatever. Full-time employees. Why do we need to do that? And of course, the immediate reaction in the town itself is parents stop trying. Why do we have to get involved in organizing a track and field club, et cetera, or whatever? Since the town's going to do it. I'm going to call one of these recreation people and ask them about that. Couldn't you put a track and field club together for our kids? You know what I mean? And after a while, people think this is normal. I remember my own mother-in-law, God bless her, now departed soul. When I was in the health and fitness business, I had a large business. We had 3 50,000 square foot clubs, private clubs, which had tennis courts, squash courts, Olympic swimming pools, gymnasiums, medical facilities, cardiac rehabilitation facilities, all that kind of stuff. And we had about 6,000 members. And one day, this government organization decided it wanted to build a club just as big as the kind that we owned, about a mile away. And so I complained to my mother-in-law, and I said, and my mother-in-law and her family were hardwares. They were making screws, nuts, and bolts and things, and packaging them and selling them in hardware stores. It was a big national business. And I complained to her about these people who were opening up near my business. I said, it's government. I said, it's not costing them. They're not paying for land. The government's putting up the building, et cetera. And my members are going to be going over there because they're charging half the price because they don't have to charge what it actually costs. And they're going to kill their business. And she said, well, what do you expect the government to do? Isn't that the kind of thing they ought to be doing? So you see what I mean? She'd already normalized the idea that the government ought to be building health clubs. So I turned to her and I said, why shouldn't the government be making nails and screws and nuts and bolts at half price and selling those to people that you're selling them to now? And at least that stopped her complaint, and she understood what I was getting at. But in these ways, you see, the state is undermining free enterprise, concepts of private property, and the natural family by taking away from it these special duties and obligations that parents not only have, but ought to have for their own children.
William, can I ask a question, please?
Please.
Yeah. By the way, so far it's brilliant. Thank you so much. You're speaking about the interaction between families in the community, the ability to initiate projects together, clubs together, and all the rest of it. And the government took over, and the municipalities. Do you see a connection between this intervention of the government in our private life on such a scale to our inability to recognize the state as a potential enemy and to resist?
Absolutely. I think that's what I'm trying to say, except maybe you said it better than I did. I think that's why I call it substitute love. The state wants you to love it. It wants you to be thankful and grateful. It's almost like that Stockholm effect, the Stockholm Syndrome. You all know what that is.
Yes.
Where these, I think originally it came from a actual event in Stockholm, or if I'm not wrong, where some group got kidnapped. Half a dozen people were kidnapped. They had a terrible time being in the handling of their kidnappers. But after a while, they began to like their kidnappers, appreciate them for what they were getting from them, because they didn't have anything else. There was nowhere else that the sandwiches were coming from, or the water, or the permission to go to the bathroom, and all the rest of it. So I think that's called the Stockholm Syndrome, where the captive begins to love the captor. Well, I think that's the situation. I don't want to exaggerate, because there are still a few free-minded people around, but that's the situation that the modern citizenry is in with respect to the growing state. And by the way, states never go the other way. Unless there's a crisis in which they collapse through bankruptcy or war, governments always increase in size. I don't know a single historical example of a state voluntarily shrinking itself or reducing its own size. And I always say to people, have you ever heard of a government manager going to his boss and telling him he wants a smaller budget and a smaller department for next year because he thinks he can do it more efficiently? It's always the other way. We need more staff, we need a bigger budget, and so on. And it's important to understand that this stuff gets normalized. It gets normalized, so if you speak against it, you become the abnormal commentator on the situation. Around my area, we have some amazing roads. If you're a cyclist, I love them. But there's almost no traffic on a lot of them. They're beautifully paved. And usually all the big paving movement comes at the end of the budget year, because the works departments don't want to be stuck with any excess money in their budgets. In fact, they want to overspend just enough to go to their bosses, their higher ups, and say, we need more money. Why? Because they want a bigger department. They want more workers. It's very human, it's very natural, and it's part of the anti-family syndrome, if you see the connection I'm trying to make here, which is that governments want to develop all kinds of methods of substitute caring so that you will appreciate them and fork over more taxes. You can't go to a concert in Toronto, which is a city of 3 million people. You can't go to a concert in this city or anything like that, any big artistic event or whatever, without seeing billboards and signs on the wall thanking various levels of government for these productions. And yet, I wager that if you did a inventory of the salaries of all the citizens who are going to the ballet and the opera and the symphony, whatever, you'd find that most of them make a hell of a lot of money and they don't need to be subsidized. But the government doesn't care. They realize that they're going to be thankful for this cultural product, which has been made available to them at a relatively cheap price, certainly not the market price of the event itself. Now, these things are very peculiar and unusual in our time. This morning, I went to our local hospital, which is a very good research hospital in Toronto for an annual checkup, whatever. And my wife and I noticed that the hospital is huge. It's like a big university campus, and there are buildings all over the place. And Canada has a socialized medical system. It's not really socialized in the sense that the government owns anything, but it controls it. Most hospitals are privately owned in this country. Most doctors have private services, but the government controls everything they do. what they're allowed to do, what they're allowed to charge. They can't charge over, $10 for this test or that test. So they're not free agents anymore. And the role that the government has in controlling all this, I mean, the political role is, we are good for you. We are looking after you. We are your health care. We, the government. And every time the government budget comes up, there's more banter about how we need more money for health care. But as my wife was saying when we drove in there this morning, if you look at the first 4 or 5 buildings, I mean, these are 5 or 6 story buildings all spread all over this kind of hospital campus. They all have private names on them because they're private donors who've given them the millions of dollars, which Lord knows is very generous of them. But in exchange for what? In exchange for getting their name on the building. So here we have government-controlled healthcare system with private donors' names on every one of those buildings as you drive around the campus. You won't see anything that says Government of Ontario Cancer Service or Government of Ontario Cardiac Unit or anything like that. It says, the J.R. Folsom or the whatever, because somebody gave them a few $million.
It's always like that. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, this is what the government does. It's like a parasite. It's a leeching organization on the production abilities of the middle class and the people who actually produce something.
Yes, it's all of that. Now, it's interesting in Canada because no one knows in Canada what anything medical costs. I am going to come back to the family, but no one knows what anything costs in our medical system. I've had lots of medical treatment here and good medical treatment. The only complaint you really have in Canada is that it takes forever. Like I have a serious illness I want to see a specialist about. I was told about this 8 months ago. I haven't seen him yet. So I'm 8 months down the road. I don't even know what he looks like. So that's a bit concerning if you're really in trouble. So I will say that these kinds of government systems don't want to be embarrassed. So if there is a real crisis, they can move very fast. In fact, I have a doctor who told a friend of mine who was really in terrible pain. He said, listen, I got a lineup a mile long. Strictly speaking, I can't see you for a year. That's how many appointments I have waiting. But I tell you what, he says, I want you to go to the emergency department of the local hospital. I want you to fall on the floor and start screaming your bloody head off. He said, I mean, really screaming. He said, they will grab you like a shot and they will pull you into the back room to shut you up and they will serve you and they will get you the MRI or the CT scan right away, whatever, because they don't want to be embarrassed in public. So they tend to move very fast in those kinds of emergencies. I mean, but that's the level to which this doctor had to scoop to get his buddy in quickly into the system. At any rate, I'll just give you one last shot on the medical system here. When it started in my province, which has 13 million people, the expenditures for medical care just before it became the law would have represented about 25% of all government spending in this province. So day one, that was it. They had to handle 25% of provincial GDP, so to speak, to handle all the health care they were promising us, which is a lot. Today, it's encroaching on 50%. This is 30 years later, 35 years later. It's encroaching on 50%. And ain't nothing going to stop it, as they say, because it can't be stopped because they made the promise. Although they stop it in subtle ways, they delist things. For example, there's a whole list of stuff that's covered by the government. Like I had surgery on my shoulder. No one knows what it cost. It doesn't have a cost. They just do it. The doctor has a fee. He negotiates it. They pay him. It costs them to buy whatever they bought to do my shoulder with, but I don't know what it cost. No one ever told me, you see. But what they do is there's all kinds of things on the list which suddenly are not on the list. Now you have to pay for them out of your own pocket, you see. So delisting is one way they deal with it, and triage is the other, which results in incredibly long waiting lists, so that people like me have to wait a long time to see specialists.
William,
Anyway,
I think there is
this is a long way of getting around the topic I was raising of substitute caring, and how after a while it goes backwards because of course it's not about caring at all. It's about government power and government influence in your life, and breaking up the what they call the intermediary structures, what I call the originating structure, especially of the family. And we'll get to this in the chapters on education. We discussed it a bit last time, how sex ed is a big weapon in the breakdown of the natural family and of parental authority, and of teaching children that the teacher ought to have more, and the teacher's view of free love and sex and all that ought to have more of a role in your life than your mom and dad. And of course, as I mentioned last time, they get to that position very easily by telling the kids things they want to hear. You should have sex when you feel like it, never mind what your mom and dad tell you. If you want condoms, you can get them in the school washroom. And if you need an abortion, we'll arrange it for you as a counselor. We don't even have to tell your parents. I'm not saying these things are tremendously prevalent here, but it happens. And it happens especially in places like Sweden, which set the mold and the pattern for the Western democracies for the breakdown of the family. And the only thing I admire about the Swedes was they were not duplicitous. They said, this is what we want to do. We want to break down the influence of the family. We want every woman who can work to get out and work. We want the children to be raised as much by the school and the government as by their parents. We want to de-emphasize the role of sex in human life and all that kind of thing. So I'm taking a breath here, but you get the picture, I think.
Yes, I do. I just wanted to say another hidden cost is the number of people who are dying because they have to wait for 8 months for a checkup, unless, of course, they go to the States to a private hospital. Would
but
you like?
If what you said were not true, Canada would have ended socialized healthcare decades ago. But because we're sitting right on top of the United States, because you can get in your car and drive to Buffalo in 2 hours from where I live, and you can get a MRI or a CT scan there. It's going to cost you out of your pocket instead of out of your taxes, which is a different way of getting into your pocket. But you can get it tomorrow, not like 3 months from now, and probably at a much higher technical resolution than the kinds of machinery that we have in Canada, which is almost always behind the newest developments in scanners or other types of machinery. I mean, I'm not saying we want every feature of the American health system, but if you want great machinery, that's where you're going to find it. And every year, I think somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Canadians go to the US or to the Cayman Islands or to other countries to get offshore healthcare, which we can't get here in a timely way.
Yes. Can you speak a little about the family and the home as a source of protection, and how can it protect our emotional and intimate space?
Absolutely. Thank you for raising it. I was just about to get into that. First of all, let me say that in terms of intimate emotional space, there's the home itself. There was a wonderful French psychologist years ago, who was a literary type, named Gaston Bachelard, who wrote a wonderful series of books on, for example, the psychology of the home, the psychology of the nest, the psychology of the attic, of the basement, of the whatever, in which he drew out all the wonderful feelings that we have, especially as children, growing up in our home. And of course, it almost doesn't matter what your home looks like physically. It's the fact that it is a home. And it has hopefully for you, your mother and father and all the children are living in the same place. It is, in fact, an intimate emotional space, which is protective. And I want to add to that the fact that private property and the concept of private property is essential to the notion of the private home, owned by the family, which has also been a target of socialist systems around the world. Even in Canada, I will say, where we do have certain private property rights, they are common law rights. In Canada's so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to private property is not mentioned. And the people who put that together, especially led by Pierre Trudeau, our very socialistic, very red prime minister, and the father of our current prime minister, he specifically did not want private property put in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a right of the citizen. That wasn't a mistake or something that he forgot. He realized that private property and the home have an important connection. I mean, after all, private property is pretty much the basis of economic life for so many people in the world. And just yesterday, I was checking on this in terms of asking some people involved in these statistics, what percentage of GDP in Canada and other democracies, if you can find me the numbers, is generated by family business, which is another way of saying it's generated by family private property and family free enterprise. And the number that came up was anywhere between 70 and 90%, depending on the country. It's absolutely phenomenal when you think about it, that it's family enterprises that are at the heart of pretty much every modern society, except the outright communist ones like, North Korea and Cuba. So just to respond to what you were asking, the home itself as a form of private property, including all the psychological benefits to children in particular of having a home, is simply incalculable. And I'd say the other reason I think private property must be defended openly by every citizen as important is because it tends to demystify the sovereign. So whenever there's a sovereign, someone who has power over the citizens, I think private property is a methodology for demystifying the sovereign. And my English historian friend, Professor Ian Gentles, he's an expert in British history, he tells me that not so long ago, even 17th, 18th centuries, even the king could not enter a private home in England without the permission of the owner. Even the sovereign did not have that power. So that was a wonderful example of the way in which the power of private property can resist and repulse alien power. And that's why lots of sovereigns in the world history and in the world today, like Trudeau Sr., don't want you to have it as a right. See, we still have it as a common law right, but it doesn't mean it can't be broken down easily by any government that wants to do it. I think the other thing which ties into what I'm saying about family enterprise, excuse me, is what I call the bonus system in this book. The bonus system I contrast with what I call the handicap system. In the bonus system, you get rewarded for merit. You get rewarded for hard work. You get rewarded for free enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. And it's absolutely important to a free society, of which private property is one of the building blocks, that the bonus system, as I call it, is defended. Because, as I say, look at the entirety of economic life in my country is 80 to 90% family free enterprise, which is all about the bonus system. And in the book, you'll see more about how that works. Anyway, this leads me to say something I said in an earlier session about the natural expression of differences. This is what Plato didn't like. It's what communists don't like. It's what lots of leaders who are trying to insert the state more deeply into private life don't like. And that is that the family is a natural expression and a natural generator of human differences. As I say, some smart, some stupid, some hardworking, some poor. You know, there's all kinds of differences that are generated by private families. That's what Plato hated. He wanted to get rid of that. The only way to get rid of it that he could see, and when you think about it, it made logical sense, is get rid of the private family. Get the government to do it. Just like in my town, get the government to run the soccer clubs and the hockey clubs and the bridge clubs and the dance clubs and the guitar clubs and who knows what. You see, get the family out of it. If the state runs it, it'll be the same for everybody. Getting rid of differences was getting rid of strife for him. It's hard to disagree with the logic, except for the fact that it's ruinous, because it goes against human nature and the way we have dealt with the manufacture of differences through private property and the private family is through the notion of rights. Everybody has a right to freedom. Everybody has a right to free enterprise. Everybody has a right to private property and more or less free expression. I say more or less because it's not true there's ever been 100% free expression, I think, at any point in human history. And Canada is now having huge debates about this because of the COVID thing, which I know you're having too, right? You know, do you have a right to decide what goes into your own body or not, et cetera, and very lively and actually vituperative debates taking place now over this very kind of thing. And on campuses,
William, if you don't,
go ahead.
Sorry, if you don't mind. You know, I hear you talking a lot about the citizen and what rights the citizens have. If you look at how governments are set up, citizens are property, are legal persons created by government or government actors. And citizens don't have rights. They have duties, obligations, and privileges. And if you take this back to the foundations of all law, which is natural law, man and woman have rights that are waived through consent to be governed under whatever system of government there is. So people are accepting these perceived benefits as you know, something good, and they are actually, people are doing this to themselves and then turning around and blaming the government that they consented to be governed by as the problem. And I think that there's, you know, when we go using terms like citizen and you know, see, a citizen doesn't have property rights. Now, only men and women have property rights. And you can look at how in the U.S., I mean, this is expressed in many different Supreme Court cases. I know of a couple where it's expressed even in some Canadian cases, but it's these terms, these legal terms that have been incorporated into the average Joe's vocabulary, it actually entraps them and causes a thinking down this path that there's some external source to blame, when at the end of the day, the only one that any one of us have to blame is who we see in the mirror. Would you agree with that, or no?
I don't disagree with your last statement in particular. We could probably knock this around quite a bit in terms of rights. I think the word rights itself is a word that's difficult to define. I've asked lots of people who have given lectures on rights. Okay, tell me what a right is. By the way, I'm putting aside for the moment what you said about natural law, because I more or less agree with you on that. And we spoke about natural law in this forum last time.
Well, our rights are our duty. Our duties under natural law, under God's law.
Sure. But if you're an atheist, you're going to say that's all nonsense. I'm not an atheist, so I don't say it's nonsense, but a lot of people do. So you end up talking to the wall in terms of defining what a right is. I think when it comes right down to it, and I'll get back to the family in a moment, but this is an interesting segue, that a right is simply a defensible claim. For example, in Canadian law, ancient
Absolutely.
Canadian and British law, I have a right to private property. I have a 28-acre property, beautiful property. And last week, someone came out of the forest at the other end of my property and decided to take a walk with his wife and child over my land. And I kind of waved at him from the porch and said, "Hi, I hope you're having a good day. But I just wanted you to know this is private property and we're fine with you walking through it," like once. But his view was, this is God's property. There's no such thing as private property, was his argument. That's just a convention of our times. And it happens to be written in the law and so on. And that's why I said that my private property right is just a defensible claim. And it's only defensible if I can defend it myself by getting my rifle out and walking down and marching him off the property, which I wouldn't do unless I had to, or calling the police. And if the police come, they defend my claim. But if they sniff at it, we haven't got time for that kind of stuff, then I have a right in name only, which is not defensible. So leaving aside natural rights, which are in conflict with natural law in many respects, I'm just talking about these earthly claims to rights. So I want to thank you for your comments. We could probably have a whole session on these spaces between
just
these concepts.
kind of a follow-up to what you were saying. At the end of the day, rights themselves even fall under property rights, because property is very inclusive of my body, my rights, and you know, anything that I can lay claim to, and be able to verify that claim and stand in honor, while not causing harm, injury, or loss to another. Well, so at the end of the day, even rights fall under property rights.
In a way they do, but again, we need a whole session on this. I disagree with a couple of things you said. I got my start with libertarian thinking about property, and the body is my property, form of personal property. And for the most part, that's a harmless thing to say. But when it comes to abortion, it's very harmful. And even our own Prime Minister Trudeau, before his son, who's now our Prime Minister Trudeau, he got into an argument on abortion with a feminist. And the feminist said, "My body, my right." That's the classical libertarian statement. I can do whatever I want to my own body as long as I don't harm someone else. And Trudeau looked her right in the eye. And he said, "But we're not talking about your body. We're talking about someone else's body that you happen to be carrying. It's not your body." So you see, almost every libertarian to whom I raised that question and that example backs away from the discussion because they're not equipped to have it. They want to stick with what I call their simple faith, which is they can do whatever they want as long as they don't harm someone else. No one wants to live in a society where that's the only standard of human behavior. Because, as I say, everyone would be swinging their fist right up to your nose. And they would stop at your nose because of their simple faith. But no one wants to live in a society that's that aggressive, even though it doesn't harm you directly. I believe that modern libertarian thought is powerful and compelling in a very limited sense, but it really needs full-on discussion because people are going for it as a means of combating government policy. And I did too when I got my start, especially in economic matters. I'm very much an economic libertarian, but I'm a Burkean conservative when it comes to human social life. I think Burke got it right when he said that democracy, for example, is not about today. It's not about what I can or can't do for myself or my body as long as I don't harm you. It's about the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. We have an obligation to society as a historical and social and moral reality which transcends our own personal judgments and tastes, and which is responsible for the flourishing of ourselves and our families. Once you reduce it all to a group of human beings in which no one cares what the hell you do, as long as you don't harm them, you got troubles, because you don't know where harm's going to come from, either immediately or in the immediate future or 10 years from now. Think of all the policies which were created, say, 10 years ago, which are causing harm today. But when they were created, no one thought they would cause harm. They thought they would be wonderful. So humans get surprised all the time by their policy initiatives and the harm they may or may not cause. And I think we have to be open to that. As I say, if you want to tell me you're an economic libertarian, I'm with you. I think, except for its obvious abuses and some of the, frankly, very dismaying things that are going on in free enterprise societies today, such as, 75-foot posters in the local mall of women who are hardly wearing anything, bare asses and tits sticking out all over the place. So my kids see that, and my granddaughters, and they're asking me, Grandpa, how come they're naked? That kind of thing. And I'm hard put to explain to them why that's public. So, we're living in a very different and difficult time. When I was a kid, a man who wanted pornography would have to go to some dark alley to buy it, or some sleazy hotel or something. I don't know. Today it's everywhere. It's the most populated. These are the most populated channels on the internet. And no one thinks twice about it. The very best hotels in the world are now selling the raunchiest gangbang type pornography to their guests for 10 or 12 bucks or 15 bucks or whatever it is. They don't even think about it. No one's seeing it as a reflection on themselves or on the taste or the quality of the place, the enterprise that they're running. It's simply a non-discussion. So I want to ask you, you don't have to answer, I'm asking myself too, is how did we end up in a place where this was never discussed? No one in my government or my country ever turned to the people and said, would you like to have naked women and posters in all your malls and raunchy pornography in every cheap hotel and expensive hotel in the country? Would you like to have that kind of world? And on cell phones for students, where they can watch pornography in math class when they get bored. Do you want that kind of world? No one ever asked that question. And they're not asking it now. And I don't think they're going to ask it because it's too late. But it's the world we face. And I'm sorry for this digression, but it gets me going. I want to go back, if I could, to the family home and free enterprise, and the nature of family thinking about earning a living from the home. In the 19th century, I'm only going that far back, there were big troubles with poverty and people earning what they called a living wage. And a living wage in the 19th century, and by the way, this was not considered a wage sufficient to keep, say, one young man alive. A living wage was considered a family wage. And at the time, it was considered quite appropriate to pay a single young man, for example, perhaps, I'm guessing, but perhaps half of what he would pay a man with a wife and family. And everybody accepted the fact that the man with a wife and family has expenses that the single man doesn't have. Well, if you tried that today, if you tried to say to somebody who came to you for a job, I'm only paying you half of what I'm paying this fellow because he has a family to raise, I don't know, they'd send in the government to straighten you out. The government gets sent into your operation for everything now. I sold a business that I told you about because the government was telling me what I had to pay my employees, the minimum wage, so-called, telling me who I had to hire, like how many men, how many women. I guess if I were in business today, it would be how many people of color and all that sort of thing, you know. And they were even limiting the price I was allowed by law to charge for my product, the product I was selling. So I got out. I sold the business, and I made enough money that I could retire and write books. And the book we're talking about is one of them. Well, I was very happy to get out of that world. I did not like the government telling me what to do. So I'm as radical as you or anybody listening. But the long and short of what I'm getting at here is that in the 19th century, it was women campaigning, and primarily women campaigning in the streets for what is called the family wage, which dictated family pay. And in other words, the whole social and economic fight in the 19th century was to get women and children out of the factory and off the streets and into the home, where they could be educated, because most education then, until schools came along in a more organized way, was in the home. People would hire tutors or whatever and pay them to educate their children. And by the way, I've looked into it. There's a chapter on this in this book too, on education. There's 4 of them. Literacy in the 19th century was much higher than it is today, when there was no public school run by government. There were no government schools. It was mostly private tutoring. And of course, there were some excellent private schools, many of which, at least in my country, are still around and still operating. In fact, I went to one of them 50 years ago. At any rate, I'm trying to say that there's been an amazing revolutionary turnaround in what we think about the family compared to the 19th century, where the radicals of that day were protesting against business, against free enterprise, and against slack government policies, because they wanted to get the children out of the factories and into the home, and then eventually into the schools. And they wanted women to get out of the factories too and raise those kids. They didn't want them running around by themselves, begging and stealing and all the rest of it. They eventually won that war. And for a long, long time, arguably one of the most successful periods of family history, from, say, the 1870s, when we got some control over the factory system and its usage of child labor, up until 1940s and 50s and 60s, when feminism, radical feminism, came back in, was one of the most successful periods in healthy, thriving family history. But we started turning against that with what I call radical individualism and hyper-democracy. This was the philosophy that it's not about the family, it's about the individuals in the family. We want to think of women as individual income earners and men as individual income earners, and they should all be paid the same. And we got to get them out of the house and where? Back into the factories. We got to get the women back into the factories. Well, what's the modern factory today? Well, there actually are modern factories where a lot of women are working. But, it's the dental hygienist profession, and it's all the kinds, of professions that women tend to choose that men tend not to choose. In fact, the psychology of this is quite interesting, because as soon as women start to move into a primarily male occupation, the men slowly start to migrate out. They start to find some other occupation because they don't want their work to be thought of as women's work, whether it's shoemaking or making socks or you name it. That tends to be the case. It also tends to be the case, if you look at the sociology, the socioeconomics of this, that when women come into the labor force and start to bring more money into the home, the men tend to start to work less. Not always true, of course, and I'm not aiming a finger at anybody who wants to do that. As I have said before, a marriage is like flying a 747. You can't do it alone. You can't navigate and fly at the same time. You need one to fly, one to navigate. I don't care if it's the wife or the husband. They can do either or both as long as they wish. But you can't do it alone in a family, not really. So the long and short of what I'm getting at is that we've been reversing the enormous success of the 19th century by pushing women out of the home into the labor market, where they are considered simply income earners or wage earners, just like men. And of course, the costs of that are tremendous because then they have to pay for daycare. Canada is just going through that now. They're talking about $10 a day daycare, which is probably not even a fifth of what daycare is actually costing. The rest of it would be, paid through the tax system. But the $10 a day thing is going to amount to billions of dollars anyway, and it's meant to be offered to all women just because they're women. So a woman from Toronto whose husband makes $500,000, who's on her way to her tennis lesson, can drop her kid off at $10 a day daycare, just like the woman who absolutely needs that daycare because her husband can't make enough money to support the family on his own. So this results in what a Swedish family economist called churning. Now, you churn butter. When I was a kid during the war, we were living on rations. And I remember my mother would bring her allotment of milk home or whatever and cream, and we would sit out in the porch and churn it to make butter, because the family was only allowed, 3 ounces of butter for a family of 5, whatever, which we were then, eventually 6. At any rate, churning is a word that means turning around, spinning. So this Swedish economist said that a lot of the economic activity in Sweden today, since feminism took control of the economy, really, is what he called economic churning, where the girl that you hire to look after your children at home, when you're out working at the old age center, looking after the mother of the girl who's looking after your children. So this kind of churning takes place, and it's all paid for by the government. See, the net result is zero in terms of productivity, or maybe there's some surplus above the zero amount that cancels out with those two activities of churning, economic churning. I thought that was quite an interesting observation. Now let me turn, if I could, to the one thing that I believe, it's just incredibly important. The differences between the male and the female in the marriage unit. I drew a lot of my thinking on this from a man named George Gairdner. I really recommend his book. It was called Men and Marriage. It was probably written, 1975. And I want to read you just a little bit of what I wrote about his book, because it's basically a summary of his key points. And the head of this little section is called Love and Affection, Reproduction, and Sexual Control. In his groundbreaking book, Men and Marriage, George Gairdner remarks that, quote, the crucial process of civilization is the subordination of the male sexual impulse and biology to the long-term horizons of female sexuality, unquote. He does not paint a pretty picture of men, and in the high regard in which he holds women and their values, has singled men out for a special disdain from radical feminists. And that's good, that his book has drawn disdain from radical feminists. It means his argument has the sting of truth. Men and women, he argues, giving copious factual support from every conceivable field of study, are from birth very, very different from each other. But men become radically different from women around puberty, with the onset of male androgenic hormones, and from that point onward, quote, a man's body is full only of undefined energies, and all these energies need the guidance of culture, unquote. Women have no such biological confusion, since they are aware very early that they have the miraculous capacity to bear another living human being. A man, of course, makes this role possible for her, but a woman actually carries it out by devoting her physical being to the process. We could even say that the process itself commandeers her being. Nothing about a man's body tells us he is made for any such duty, bracket, and we could as well say he is made for hard labor or for fighting, close bracket. But everything about a woman's body is manifestly designed for this purpose. Unless some social pressure is imposed to recruit men and their energies for a purpose higher than themselves and their appetites, in particular, if women are not present or not willing or lack confidence or are afraid to tame errant male proclivities, then, quote, over the whole range of human societies, men are overwhelmingly more prone to masturbation, homosexuality, voyeurism, gratuitous sexual aggression, and other shallow and indiscriminate erotic activity, close bracket. They are also overwhelmingly more prone to violent crime. Of the 12,500 prisoners in Canada's jails, barely 300 are women. Men also are far more interested than women are in hit and run sex, he calls it, one-night stands, and multiple partners. Unless there is some barrier, immediate gratification is their choice, as it is the hallmark of the criminal in all that he does. More than half of all homosexual men report having had hundreds and some thousands of partners, while lesbians normally stick to one. And you can see chapter 13 of this book on that. As for children, until they have their own kids, men from childhood are far, far less interested in them than are women. And from a sociological viewpoint, this all makes sense. A man's body, unlike a woman's, continuously creates a sexual product, plus the prostatic fluid, the latter being about 95% of the total, that accumulates in his body until released, rendering him capable of fertilizing many billions of human eggs. This tension lends an urgency to the male's indiscriminate sexual interest, the primary aim of which, unless he is taught otherwise by reality, is sexual release, not reproduction. For all males in the biological and the plant world, it seems, the natural order of fecundity is not one of efficiency, but of enormous waste, overproduction. For the female of our species, however, with but one microscopic egg at a time to protect and nurture, the entire procedure is reversed. Her tension is not driven by the need for release of a physical product, but for the emotional relaxation of security. She seeks the bonds of love and affection that orient and calm the indiscriminate male. And her best move biologically is to select the strongest one she can, and at the same time prevent him from trying to fertilize someone else's egg and switching his protective allegiance. Anyway, you get the gist of Gairdner's book. It's a super book. And since that time, I must say, evolutionary psychology has pretty much underlined everything he said in that very early book. And maybe I should close now by saying that the one emotional thing that I believe is incredibly important about the natural family, and which simply is not discussed very much at all, I don't know why, but it's not, and that is the unconditional and impartial love of parents for their own children. I would say that this is the defining characteristic of family love. Children get unconditional, even what others would say is unreasonable love from their own parents, a love that they will not get from anybody else, especially from government daycare workers, as I have mentioned before, for whom the operating ethic is equality. Susie, how are you going to look after my child when I bring him to daycare? Oh, I'll look after him just like I look after all the others. I treat them all the same. That's precisely what a child does not get from his own mother and father. From them, he gets special care, special unconditional love that he can't get at the daycare center. And by the way, that's one of the reasons And God bless a good daycare center. I think a little bit of it is good for a child. It's like socialization more than they might get at home. But if it's full time or excessive, I think it's very damaging place to be putting your child. And I certainly didn't put mine there for that reason, because I wanted them to sense the love and the bond that they could only get at home, not from the daycare center or any other place outside our home. The best demonstration of this unconditional love is a mother or a father who's sitting on the beach. And over there, his own child is drowning and calling for help. And over there, someone else's child is drowning and calling for help. Well, who do you think they're going to save? Right? No one even has to think about that. They're going to, unless they hate their own child and want to get rid of them, they're going to jump in and save their own child over anybody else's. I would say, even if there are 10 children drowning at once over there and he could save them all, if as long as he let his own drown, he won't do that. He will save his own child. That gives you a very strong sense of the unconditional parental love that's available only in the family and only in the home, and not only with private property, but bolstered by private property and ownership of the home. And as we just saw earlier, bolstered also by the activities of family enterprise, which is keeping most of our economies ticking along at a great rate. So I've been talking way too much. I want to thank you for having me again.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much for coming. Would you like to finish now, or would you like to see if there is one or two questions?
One or two questions would be fine. Yeah.
Okay. So, guys, if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, or a comment, or a thank you, or anything.
No one else is going to say anything, then I'll just say it's been lovely listening to you as always, William. And yeah, I've been doing other things in the background, but you know, it's always fascinating to hear your wisdom. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me once again.
It's our pleasure, and we will see you next Wednesday for another chapter.
Yeah, next Wednesday we'll talk about the anti-family tradition.
Yes, yes.
See you then.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. I will send you the video as soon as I saved
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye for now. See you. And I'm going to open the floor for free conversation if you guys like to continue.